There's one thing textbooks will never tell you about the American Wild West. It looked a whole lot more like a lawless third world backwater than anyone wants to admit at a dinner party. No romance in that. No golden sunset or fancy hat wipes away the fact that those towns were deposits of dust, blood, corruption, and organized impunity built around a saloon. The difference between a sheriff and a criminal? The paycheck. And sometimes not even that. What you're about to hear is not the version of the West that sells plastic toy guns to kids. It's the version that descendants of those people prefer not to bring up at family reunions. Every single thing you're about to learn was completely normal back then. Routine, sometimes even celebrated. Today, half of these practices would land you in prison, in court, and maybe starring in your own Netflix docuseries. The Wild West wasn't the land of the free. It was the land of men who could do whatever they wanted, because the government hadn't shown up to collect the bill yet. Spoiler, the bill came. But before that, let's look at what was going on out there like it was perfectly fine. Lynching as family entertainment. Imagine taking your 8-year-old to watch a public execution on a Sunday afternoon like it was a picnic. That's exactly what this was. Between 1880 and 1940, more than 4,700 people were lynched in the United States, the vast majority in the South and the West. And the detail that will genuinely disturb you. The crowds didn't hide. Entire families showed up. Street vendors set up stalls. People posed for photos next to the bodies. Postcards featuring lynching images were sold and mailed as travel souvenirs. The American Postal Service didn't ban those cards until 1908, 28 years after the practice was already happening on an industrial scale. None of the participants were prosecuted. None were arrested. The sheriff frequently watched from the sidelines with his hands in his pockets. The idea that any functioning justice system existed in the Wild West is the biggest lie American cinema ever sold to the world. Children working in coal mines at 8 years old. In the Wild West, if your kid could walk without falling over, he could work, and not light farm work either. In the coal mines of Colorado, West Virginia, and Wyoming, children as young as 8 and 9 worked as breaker boys, hunched over for 12-hour shifts, separating coal from rock with their bare hands. Their fingers bled. Their backs curved permanently. Many went deaf from the constant noise of the machinery. Wages ran around $1 a day, sometimes less, and often paid not in cash, but in company store credit, which charged prices no reasonable person would call fair. In 1890, the U.S. Census recorded more than 1,700,000 children under 15 in the formal labor market. That's without counting those who worked off the books. The first federal law prohibiting child labor didn't come until 1938. That's 48 years after photography was already documenting children with old men's faces working in the dark, selling opium freely at the corner pharmacy. Headache? Opium? Toothache? Opium? Baby crying too much? Children's opium, available on the shelf under a lovely name like soothing syrup. In the Wild West, drugs that today put people in prison for decades were sold at the pharmacy without a prescription, without regulation, and without any warning that they caused brutal chemical dependency. The Sears and Roebuck catalog of 1898 sold morphine injection kits by mail, just like that, in the catalog, right next to tools and seeds. Bayer, the German company, launched heroin in 1898 as a safer substitute for morphine and sold it in the United States as a cough remedy. Yes, heroin as a cough remedy. The idea was that it wasn't addictive. It was, of course. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, the first American law regulating opioids, only came in 1914. Until then, anyone of any age could buy chemical dependency with pocket change. Legal duels in the middle of the street. The duel wasn't the exception. It was protocol. In several Wild West states, you could challenge a man to a formal duel, and if he accepted, you could kill that man in front of witnesses without committing any crime. It was called a fair fight, and the law treated it as an agreement between adults. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the Earp brothers were at the center of the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, in October of 1881. 3 men died in under 30 seconds. Were Earp and Holliday put on trial? Yes. Were they convicted? No. The judge ruled it was a legal confrontation. In Abilene, Kansas, Wild Bill Hickok accidentally shot his own deputy during a street gunfight and was acquitted because he was performing his duties as sheriff. Killing someone by accident while handling a public situation was considered an occupational hazard. Today, we call that involuntary manslaughter, and you go to prison. Back then, they called it Monday. De facto slavery after abolition. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, but it left a loophole the size of Texas. Slavery was still permitted as punishment for a crime. And the American South understood that message very well. Within less than a year of abolition, states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas created the Black Codes, laws that criminalized things like vagrancy, meaning a black man without a job could be arrested. Once imprisoned, he would be sentenced to forced labor and leased to farmers. mining companies, and construction firms. Known as convict leasing, the system turned prisons into factories of legal slavery. Men worked in chains, died in mines, and were beaten by guards. The difference from the previous slavery? The state collected the payment, not the owner. In Texas, the convict leasing system lasted until 1912. In some southern states, disguised forms of this practice survived all the way to World War II. Freedom, in many cases, had lasted less than a year. Brothels. Operating openly, right next to the church. In Deadwood, South Dakota, during the gold boom of the 1870s, the ratio was roughly 1 woman for every 20 men in town. Brothel owners didn't hide. Al Swearingen, owner of the Gem Variety Theater in Deadwood, ran one of the most famous brothels in the territory with total freedom. Women were brought in under promises of legitimate jobs, especially immigrants who didn't speak English, and then placed in situations they couldn't escape. Today, that would be called human trafficking. Back then, the sheriff was drinking at the bar next door. In Tombstone, Arizona, the Birdcage Theater operated continuously for 8 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Inside it were gambling tables, shows, and 16 compartments for various activities, hung along the walls like little bird cages. The city government collected taxes from the establishment, a public-private partnership, you might say, selling indigenous land through contracts signed by nobody. The U.S. government signed more than 500 treaties with Native nations between 1778 and 1971. More than 500 treaties. Know how many were honored in full? None. 0. You can check the congressional record. The logic was simple. Sign the treaty, wait for gold or cattle to show up in the region, declare the treaty void on any pretext, send in the army, take the land. The Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 guaranteed the Sioux tribes the Black Hills of Dakota forever. 6 years later, General George Custer confirmed there was gold there. By 1876, the Army was driving the Sioux out of those same Black Hills that the treaty said were theirs forever. Today, that's called contract fraud in violation of international treaty. Back then, they called it manifest destiny, a nice name for legalized theft. Drinking adulterated whiskey that actually killed people. The whiskey served in Wild West saloons was not the Jack Daniels at your favorite bar. It was a mix of industrial alcohol, chewed tobacco, cayenne pepper, honey, and sometimes a dash of strychnine to give it that appealing caramel color. Strychnine, the poison used in rat killer. In low doses, it gave a warm sensation in the stomach. In slightly higher doses, it caused convulsions and death. But who was measuring? The bartender with the dirty glass? Wild West whiskey had so many names that were basically confessions of guilt. Tarantula juice, snake poison, coffin varnish, gut warmer. Coffin varnish, gut warmer. The guys had zero shame, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration only began regulating what was inside food and drink with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Until then, what was in your glass was literally a mystery with homicidal potential, betting the farm, the horse, and sometimes the wife at the saloon. In the Wild West, the saloon wasn't just a bar. It was a bank, a courthouse, a stock exchange, and a casino, all running on the same dirty counter at the same time. And bets had no legal limit on what could be wagered. Men bet horses, cattle, tools, land parcels, and in documented cases, their own wives. Not as a metaphor, as a verbal contract between men that local law recognized as valid. The most popular Wild West card game was Faro, an 18th century game that required only that the player have more confidence than common sense. Professionals like Doc Holliday made their living at it and were treated like celebrities. In Dodge City, Kansas, Sheriff Wyatt Earp's records include disputes over gambling debts that involved entire properties changing hands overnight. Today, any unregulated bet of that size requires a formal contract, a lawyer, and depending on the state, a casino license. Back then, all it took was your word and the pistol on your hip as collateral. Prisoner torture as standard procedure. In Wild West penitentiaries, the goal wasn't rehabilitation, it was destruction. Yuma Prison in Arizona operated from 1876 to 1909 and became known as the Hellhole on the Colorado for one simple reason. The internal temperature of the stone cells reached 113 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. Prisoners were placed in dark cells, underground pits with no light, no ventilation, nothing but a dirt floor, for days or weeks as punishment for any infraction. Beating with a leather strap was standard disciplinary procedure. Prisoners who attempted escape and were recaptured received a special treatment. Extra chains and forced labor in a rock quarry under direct sun. No lawyer, no appeal. No family visit guaranteed by law. The Eighth Amendment has prohibited cruel and unusual punishment since 1789, but in Wild West prisons, that constitutional text clearly had no delivery address. Vigilantes, deciding who deserved to live. When there was no official law, the community improvised its own. And the result was exactly what you'd expect when you take law out of the hands of the state and put it in the hands of a group of angry men. Vigilance committees were groups that formed in mining and cattle towns to deliver justice on their own terms. In San Francisco, the Vigilance Committee of 1856 had more than 6,000 members and hanged at least 4 men, banished dozens, and flogged others, all without a court, without a jury, without a defense. In Montana, in the 1860s, the group known as the Montana Vigilantes was responsible for at least 21 hangings in less than a year. Some of those men were guilty of real crimes. Others were executed over personal rivalries, for being foreigners, or simply for being in the wrong place when the mob decided to do something useful with the afternoon. The difference between a vigilante and a lyncher was just the hat. Fraudulent patent medicines sold as miracles. Got tuberculosis? We have a syrup for that. Cancer? A pill? Impotence? Electricity? Seriously, electricity. Wild West patent medicines were products sold with completely invented medical promises, protected by no law, and distributed by traveling salesmen who arrived in colorful wagons, put on a show, sold their little bottles, and left town before half the buyers realized they'd taken alcohol with food coloring. Hanlon's Wizard Oil promised to cure rheumatism, headache, toothache, deafness, and colic. The main active ingredient was alcohol, reaching 70% of the composition in some products. Lydia E. Pinkham's vegetable compound was sold for female weakness and contained 18% alcohol. Women who couldn't drink in public for moral reasons took the medicinal compound and felt just fine, thank you. Federal regulation of medicines in the United States only began in earnest in 1906. Until then, it was every man for himself in the miracle marketplace. Cattle theft punishable by death, land theft punishable by nothing. Here is the Wild West value system summarized in one sentence. Stealing a wealthy white man's cattle could get you killed. Stealing an entire indigenous family's land was government policy. The Homestead Act of 1862 distributed more than 270 million acres of American land to white settlers. Much of that territory legally belonged to native nations under treaties still in force. The government simply ignored the treaties. Meanwhile, in Wyoming in 1892, the large ranchers of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association hired gunmen to kill small farmers and cowboys accused of cattle theft, an event known as the Johnson County War. 22 professional hired guns were brought in from Texas. Men were murdered. Nobody was convicted. The private property of those with money was sacred. The property of those without it was no man's land, available to whoever showed up first with a shotgun. Sexual slavery of Asian women in San Francisco. During the gold rush and railroad construction, tens of thousands of Chinese men arrived in California. With them, or rather after them and without any consent, came women. The Tong houses of San Francisco were controlled by criminal organizations that trafficked women and girls from China with promises of marriage or work, then held them in captivity in what would later be known as Chinatown. A girl could be purchased for $40 and sold for $400 according to documents of the era. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 made it impossible for these women to seek help from authorities because any contact with the government could result in deportation. It took years of work by missionaries like Donaldina Cameron, who literally broke down doors with the sheriff to rescue women before any systematic action was taken. Cameron rescued more than 3,000 women between 1895 and 1939. 3,000. Use of armed force against striking workers. Workers who complained about inhumane conditions in the Wild West didn't receive negotiation. They received state and corporate-sponsored violence. In Ludlow, Colorado, in April of 1914, the Colorado National Guard attacked a tent colony of striking miners from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by the Rockefellers. The miners had moved out of company-owned housing and were camped with their entire families. The National Guard set fire to the camp. 20 people died, including 2 women and 11 children who were hiding in a pit beneath a tent. This event became known as the Ludlow Massacre and triggered a week of open combat across Colorado. President Woodrow Wilson himself had to send in federal troops to separate the sides. Those responsible for the massacre, none were criminally prosecuted. The company paid 0 compensation. The Rockefellers hired a public relations expert. That is the birth of corporate spin in the United States, killing bison for sport and leaving the bodies to rot. In 1870, there were between 30 and 60 million bison on the American Great Plains. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. In 19 years, one of the largest megafauna populations in planetary history was nearly exterminated. And it wasn't by accident. The U.S. government actively encouraged bison hunting as a war strategy against the Plains Indian nations, who depended on the animals for everything: food, clothing, tools, shelters. Without bison, survival on the territory was impossible. General Philip Sheridan actually declared that the bison hunters had done more to resolve the Indian problem than the entire army had done in 30 years. Hunting excursions were organized as luxury tourism. Wealthy men arrived by train, shot bison from the windows of moving rail cars, and the train kept going without stopping so clients wouldn't have to step off. The bodies stayed where they fell, rotting under the sun, poisoning rivers with mercury to extract gold. The California Gold Rush produced around $550 million in gold between 1848 and 1855. The environmental cost, it was never calculated because the category of environmental cost simply didn't exist as a legal concept. Hydraulic mining, a technique developed in the 1850s, used high-pressure water cannons to knock down entire mountainsides, then separated the gold using mercury. Liquid mercury contaminates soils and rivers for decades. In 1999, American scientists estimated that the California Gold Rush had introduced more than 26 million ounces of mercury into the state's rivers and bays, equivalent to more than 730 metric tons of the metal. The Sacramento River and San Francisco Bay still carry detectable concentrations of mercury derived from 19th century mining. Eat a fish from that river today, and you're technically consuming the legacy of the gold rush. Racial segregation with the force of law. Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 didn't invent segregation. It merely formalized it as American constitutional doctrine. In the Wild West, segregation was daily practice. Separate schools, separate trains, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate cemeteries. In many states, it was a crime for a black man and a white woman to marry. In others, it was a crime for a black person to live within city limits after sundown, the so-called sundown towns. More than 10,000 American cities had some form of explicit racial restriction against black, Jewish, or Asian residents in their property deeds. These clauses were called restrictive covenants and were legally enforceable until the Supreme Court declared them unenforceable in 1948. Not illegal, just unenforceable. The difference is small on paper, but enormous in practice for anyone trying to buy a house. Unlicensed doctors, operating on their own. In the Wild West, anyone with a scalpel and enough confidence not to shake too badly could open a practice. There was no mandatory federal medical license, no minimum curriculum, no standard way to verify whether a person had studied medicine or simply enjoyed anatomy as a hobby. In 1876, the New York Times estimated there were more than 60,000 doctors practicing in the United States with no verifiable formal training. Amputation was the default response to almost any bullet wound or serious infection because it was the fastest procedure and, with luck, stopped gangrene from spreading. Mortality rates in Wild West surgeries, even in the hands of doctors with some training, reached 25% in major procedures. Anesthesia was ether or poorly dosed chloroform, sometimes just whiskey. The first American state to require a verified medical license was Illinois in 1877. Most states only created real regulation at the turn of the 20th century, dumping industrial waste directly into rivers. Before any environmental law existed in the United States, the rule was simple. If there's a river near the factory, the river is your disposal system. The Chicago slaughterhouses were the most notorious example. Millions of liters of blood, animal fat, and waste were dumped directly into the Chicago River and Lake Michigan, the same lake from which the city of Chicago drew its drinking water. Slow on logic, quick on cholera. Upton Sinclair described the state of Chicago's slaughterhouses in his book, The Jungle of 1906, with such detail that President Theodore Roosevelt read the book, became nauseated, and immediately pushed for the Federal Meat Inspection Act. What the president didn't realize was that Sinclair was trying to draw attention to the working conditions of the employees, not to what was in his sandwich. But it worked for meat regulation. The workers kept waiting for their rights for decades, enslaving Apache war prisoners on farms. In September of 1886, Apache leader Geronimo surrendered to the U.S. Army after years of resistance in Arizona and New Mexico. The surrender was negotiated with promises that he and his group would be sent to Florida for 2 years, and then allowed to return to the Southwest. Those promises were broken immediately. Geronimo and more than 450 Apaches, including warriors who had fought alongside the U.S. Army as scouts, were loaded onto a train and sent to Fort Pickens, Florida. Then to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama, then to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Geronimo never returned to Arizona. He died at Fort Sill in 1909, 23 years after his surrender. During that time, his tribe was used as labor on farms and in public exhibitions. In 1904, he was paraded on horseback at President Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration, a prisoner of war displayed as a trophy, running electoral campaigns with ghost votes and open fraud. Democracy in the Wild West was a work of science fiction. In 19th century elections, buying votes was common, assumed, and sometimes done in public without the slightest embarrassment. Candidates sent whiskey wagons through neighborhoods on Election Day. Selling your vote for $2 and a drink was a transaction known as treating, considered a fair exchange of favors between gentlemen. In New York, the Tammany Hall political machine manufactured votes on an industrial scale. Newly arrived immigrants were taken to naturalize and vote on the same day, sometimes multiple times on the same day at different locations. Political boss William Marcy Tweed controlled New York City government for years and diverted between $30 and $200 million from public coffers. At the higher estimates, that equals more than $4 billion in today's dollars. He was arrested, escaped to Spain, was extradited, died in prison in 1878. At least that part worked. Private banks, creating their own money. Before 1863, the United States had no standardized national currency. It had more than 1,600 different private banks, each issuing its own banknotes. The value of a note depended on the reputation of the bank that issued it. And how would you know which bank was trustworthy when you were 500 kilometers away from where the note was issued? You didn't. There were publications called banknote reporters that listed which banks were in good standing and which were on the verge of collapse. But those publications were weeks out of date by the time they reached the West. You could wake up with $20 in your pocket and discover that the bank that issued them had failed the week before, and your money was worth the paper it was printed on. Literally. The National Banking Act of 1863 began creating a more uniform system, but the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank as we know it, was only created in 1913. Until then, it was financial witch hunt territory, using forced Native American labor in missions. The California mission system, begun by the Spanish in 1769 and continued after American territorial incorporation, was essentially a prison with a cross on top. Native Americans were brought into the missions, baptized, and from that point considered neophytes, Christians in training who could no longer leave. Fleeing the mission was a crime. Those who fled were hunted down, brought back, and punished with flogging. Labor was compulsory: construction, agriculture, cattle ranching. Conditions were so precarious that the native population of California dropped from approximately 300,000 in 1769 to fewer than 100,000 by 1832, a reduction of 2/3 in 63 years. Disease, forced labor, and violence are the three culprits. The founder of the system, Junipero Serra, was canonized by Pope Francis in 2015. The canonization triggered protests across the state of California, burning entire cities to drive out Black communities. In May and June of 1921, the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was destroyed. Greenwood was known as Black Wall Street because of the extraordinary prosperity of its Black community. More than 200 businesses, hospitals, hotels, schools, 2 newspapers. It was a community that had built wealth from nothing after slavery. In 2 days, it was destroyed by a white mob supported by the Oklahoma National Guard, which even used airplanes to fire on residents. 35 city blocks were burned. More than 1,200 homes destroyed. The death toll was never definitively established. Estimates range from 300 to 3,000. The survivors were arrested, not the attackers. No federal compensation was paid. The massacre was suppressed from Oklahoma history books for decades. In 1991, 70 years later, a state commission began officially investigating what had happened, auctioning off Indigenous orphans' land to settlers. The Dawes Act of 1887 was presented as a humanitarian reform to help Native Americans integrate into American society. In practice, it was a mechanism of legal expropriation on a continental scale. The law divided Native reservations into individual plots and distributed parcels to each tribal member. The land left over after distribution was sold to white settlers as surplus land. Between 1887 and 1934, Native Americans lost 90 million acres of land they held in reservations. From 138 million acres, 48 million remained, a 65% reduction in 47 years. And when the head of household died without a registered will, the government appointed white guardians who often sold the remaining land. Native children were legally left without property their parents had held, and the land went to public auction. It was theft with an official form attached. Injectable drugs sold in mail-order catalogs. The Sears, Roebuck & Company catalog was the Amazon of the 19th century. You ordered by mail, and it arrived at your door. And among the available options in the 1898 catalog, right alongside tools, clothing, and household items, was a complete morphine injection kit for $1.50. The kit included the syringe, the needles, and enough morphine to begin the process of chemical dependency quite comfortably. It wasn't a hidden product or a discreet sale. It was in the catalog with a photo and a price. Morphine was widely prescribed to Civil War veterans, who became known as the Army disease due to the extremely high rate of addiction among former soldiers. The USA government created a generation of chemical dependence on the battlefields and then sent them home with no treatment system whatsoever. The Sears catalog merely completed the service. Federal narcotics regulation only came in 1914 with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, denying women the right to vote by law. Until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, voting in the United States was a right exclusive to men in almost every state. And even within that system, only white men with property could vote in the Republic's early years. Wyoming was the first American territory to grant women the vote in 1869, not out of altruism, but demographic strategy. There were so few women in the territory that legislators thought voting rights would attract more female settlers. Colorado followed in 1893. Other states resisted for decades. Susan B. Anthony was arrested in 1872 for voting in a presidential election in New York. She was tried, sentenced to pay a $100 fine, refused to pay, and was never forced to pay either. The judge feared that imprisonment would make her a martyr. She died in 1906, 14 years before seeing American women win the right she had exercised illegally decades earlier, 10 men sharing one bed at the boarding house by contract. The Wild West towns grew faster than any infrastructure could keep up with. One week, there was open plain. The next, there were 5,000 miners who needed a bed. The result was the boarding house, where rooms were rented by shift, not by night. One man slept from 6 in the morning to noon, another from 2 to 8. The bed never got cold. In some boarding houses in Deadwood and Virginia City, the system was even more creative. A row of mattresses on the floor with men sleeping side by side like sardines in a can, 10 cents a night. No window, no ventilation, no concept whatsoever of personal hygiene. The bunkhouses on cattle ranches were the rural version of the same problem. 12 cowboys in one room, one bucket of water for everyone to wash with. And whoever arrived last washed with the same water as whoever came first. Today, any landlord who tried to rent property under those conditions would receive a fire code violation before finishing the pitch. Sheriff was a popularity contest, not a qualification. In the Wild West, the position of sheriff required no training, no physical test, no law degree, and no verifiable qualifications of any kind. It required votes. And votes, in that context, basically meant whoever bought the most rounds at the saloon in the week before the election. In many counties across Texas, Kansas, and Arizona, the sheriff was elected annually by the local population, and the selection criteria were reputation, charisma, and a willingness to draw a weapon without hesitating too long. Bat Masterson, one of the most famous sheriffs of Dodge City, was 23 years old when he took the position of Ford County Sheriff in Kansas in 1877. No police academy, no internship, no job interview. In several documented cases, the elected sheriff had a prior criminal record in that same county. The logic was impeccable. If he knew the criminals, it was because he understood the business. Today, a police candidate goes through months of training, psychological testing, and background investigation. In the Wild West, all you needed was the right hat and no open tab at the bar.